So yeah, I want to chat to you this evening about what's new in CSS in 2023. When I was putting this presentation together, I realized that there's an awful lot, which is pretty cool. And we just came from some experimental stuff. So a nice little transition from that is here's some stuff that you can use today. Supported in all the major browsers. Container queries. So I feel like these have been talked about a lot over the recent years, but we've finally got support for them in all major browsers. And I remember hearing a Rachel Andrews talk at Web Directions many years ago, talking about why this was a feature that many developers asked for, but it wasn't possible to deliver. And then browser mechanisms changed in some of the core functionality, and suddenly this popped back up on the scene again. And it was now possible due to a lot of refactoring efforts that the web browser teams have been making over the years. So yeah, it's nice to see that we can finally use them now. So instead of being restricted to media queries and querying the total screen width, you can design components like this, where they actually change CSS properties and layout based on the width of the container. So it allows you to create really reusable components. The classic example is a card component that you might want to display as a nice wide component on desktop, but then when you get down to mobile, you want to reuse that same component, but in a stacked configuration. So very exciting. We can finally use them in production. Wide-gamut color spaces. So I've heard sRGB, which is the default color space for the web, referred to as stupid RGB. And the reason this is the case is here are all the colors that are available in sRGB, and you can see the many more colors that are available when you expand that color space. So on the left are some of the new color spaces that you can use in major browsers. We've also got a color mix function now. So often in design systems, you'll have different shades of color. And this makes it really easy to do that because you can do this. And there's a nice little Venn diagram that you can see in Chrome DevTools here. So you can define all of the different shades for your theme based on the base color. Previously, you'd have to get the hex codes from the designers of every different shade and hard code them. Now we can write code like this. So we've now got trig functions in CSS. If you want to do some complicated stuff, all the basic operations there, and that's an example of what you can do with that. You can do really cool animations like this using those calculations. Nth child now has extra functionality, like so, and this gives us the ability to write stuff like this, nth child 2 of dot highlight, and you can see an example of what we can produce here of styling these different album artwork depending on what child they were and where they were in the hierarchy. I must say I did look at that example and think, do you want to draw different borders around all of them? But if you want to, you can, and I'm sure people will come up with some very creative uses for this. Now, accent colors are an interesting one, especially around theming, as operating systems now have light and dark mode and more theming options. Accent colors ties in nicely with this, in that default controls like checkboxes. Previously, were more difficult. You had to do custom stuff to control the style. Now you can just specify an accent color, and these native controls will now match that. And you can build stuff that looks like this quite easily. And currently, it works with the following input elements. This is probably one of my favorite ones, to be honest. Small but effective individual transform properties. So previously, when specifying transforms, you had to specify translate, rotate, and scale all together. Now you can specify them as different properties, which means that you can override only one of them. This is really useful for animations, where you might be animating between a whole bunch of different values, or if you're overriding stuff, you no longer need to hard code in all the values, even if the rotate value might not be changing at all. If you're just playing around with scaling something, you can just target that directly. Dynamic viewport units are also really exciting. With mobile devices as they are, you can often end up with different viewport sizes depending on the browser configuration, and we can now target them accurately with these units, as opposed to previously where we only had VH to play around with, and we had to do all sorts of weird hacks to get stuff working. So now we have these units to play around with, the smallest active viewport size, the largest, and the dynamic viewport height and width. CSS Layers, this is actually an example of me using it. I added this into an app that we have last year, actually, and I was having some issues with our design library. I needed to do some custom stuff, and the design library was overriding all of our application styles. And I was like, if only there was a nice simple way to do this. And then I was like, hang on, just read about CSS layers the other day. I think this is a perfect candidate for that. And it turns out that it was. I was able to add a very simple line like that, and suddenly all of the styles in the component library were in a separate scope. And the way it works by default is everything that's not in a CSS layer has higher priority than the stuff that is in a layer. So you can do quite complicated stacks. This is kind of showing the order of priority, and you can do very complicated stuff where you break out your app into like your base layer and your theme and individual components. But you can also use it for really simple examples where you leave everything as is. So perfect for adding to an existing production application. You don't need to rewrite the whole thing. You can just use it for a specific part of the app. All right, so now we're on to some features that you can still use in some modern browsers, but not all of them, unfortunately. So native CSS nesting. So Sass has finally influenced native CSS here. So you'll be able to do nesting like this, nesting media queries and hover styling, which is really nice. You don't need a preprocessor like Sass to do that basic stuff anymore, and it makes the code a lot more readable. We've also got has. So this is a really cool way of being able to style something in a child element based on the parent. So you can see here that we're able to apply a background color based on whether this item has the star class or not. We've also got scroll-based animations. So you can actually define an animation now based on the scroll position of a container. So you can do some really cool effects, such as this one that the Chrome team put together, where you're recreating Apple's album UI. And as you can see here, I'm dragging the slider, and every position here is just tied to a scroll position and animates in between. So I thought that was very, very cool. And you can view the source code to that on Google's developer site. Initial letter allows you to customize the positioning of single letters that you're styling for effects like that. Now, popover API, this is really exciting. So previously had to write lots of custom code to get modals and popover controls working. Well, now we're going to be able to do a lot of that natively. So this is available in Chrome and Safari Technology Preview. So you can just add popover to a div to define the actual content of the popover, and then you can add a target to a button to actually invoke that popover. Some of the cool things about popovers, they've got this concept of a top layer, so you don't have to worry about z-index, a million. He's written a really large z-index just to get it working. We've been there. We don't need to go there again. So we've also got light dismiss behavior. So when you click outside an element, we want to close the pop-up. Previously, you had to write bits of JavaScript to do this, or maybe your popover library would deal with this. That's also part of this feature. And you've got default accessibility as well for the popover out of the box. You can now animate display. So as part of the popover stuff, and I guess this ties into some of the view transition stuff as well. So that's pretty cool. And yeah, that's part of being able to animate between this top layer and a non-top layer. And you can see there that you've got that little popover open pseudo class. So that allows you to control more styling around the popover. So here's an example of a popover that's entirely native. So you can see that when they click outside the view, it dismisses automatically and still has all of that default behavior. We've also got text wrapped balance. So this is a nice little thing for headings. So you can see with and without there. Just makes the text look nicer as a block. This only works for a few lines of text. So this is more for your headings, your card titles, stuff like that, to just make them a bit more aesthetic without having to do anything extra. So now we're back to the experimental features. So there's some really cool stuff coming up that we can't use yet. Maybe we'll be able to use it around the time when you can play around with the Apple headset in Australia. I don't know. Scoped styles. So previously we had to rely on BEM or stuff like CSS modules to isolate CSS and stop third-party dependencies from conflicting, or even just within our app. And now you can use scope styles to do that. So here, this title, it's not going to affect anything else. You've also got anchor positioning. This I'm very excited about because I must confess I have wasted way too much time in previous roles fiddling around with tooltips and writing custom JavaScript or finding a JavaScript library to handle the positioning, because if you've ever written a tooltip before, you'll know that if you're trying to anchor it on the left-hand side of the screen and the tooltip is quite wide, it might go off the screen. And so obviously that's not ideal. So then you want to be able to align it right. but then that requires detecting where in the viewport it is with funky JavaScript, or what happens if they scroll and now it's out of view. So anchor positioning allows you to do that natively, which I think is very exciting. So that's another 20 kilobytes that you can save off your JavaScript bundle. I've also got custom styling for select menus now. So finally, right? So you can recreate your Photoshop typography menus. I swear that's the only native app I've seen that actually changes the typography for, I'm sure there are others, but yeah, so you can do that on the web now without having to rebuild the entire component yourself. So that's yes, I'm excited and terrified about what designers will be able to come up with this. And here's an example of some markups. So you've got these slots that you can hook into and add your custom styling. So I've got a bunch of links here that you can go to for further reading. As always, the Chrome team do a fantastic job of putting together videos of upcoming features. I got a lot of the content from that as well. And if you want to deep dive into some of these topics a bit more, for example, the color space stuff, there's a whole world that you can dive into there on all the functionality that's available there, and more information about how color spaces work. And if you want more content like this, I do have a newsletter and podcast that I'm publishing at the moment. So I'm trying to write more little roundups of new CSS and front end and tech stuff. So you can view that at my website there. So thank you.